Hello there my friends, and welcome back to another book review and discussion video here on the channel. First of all, apologies for having no video out last week. I know I kind of promised I would make these a weekly thing, but I just couldn't muster the time and the energy to write a script last week. Hopefully I'll make 2 videos this week, Sigmar and my crippling depression willing. But at the very least, we are doing this one. So today I wanted to talk to you about another fairly famous, I'd say, trilogy of Warhammer books. There's actually a few unique quirks about this trilogy which make it a bit special among Warhammer Fantasy series. And we're obviously gonna go through them in this video. Before we get started though, I would like to kindly remind you that if you enjoy these videos, would like to see more of them, and more importantly, if you'd like to access my old library of content from the old channel, including all my narrations, including the trilogy we're discussing today, please join me on my Patreon. There's over 500 of us there already, and you can join as a free member and check out if you'd like to support me further after that. Links for everything important are in the description. Thank you. Now, the trilogy in question is none other than the Witch Hunter series written by CL Werner, or as it's more officially known, Matthias Thulmann Witch Hunter. This is a story about, you guessed it, a witch hunter. Or if you want to get a bit more into the lore, a Templar of the Order of Sigmar, or a Sigmarite Templar. They actually have a bunch of different names for their organizations and branches of the church. But, you know, in the backwater villages of the Empire, they are witch hunters. Basically, witch hunters in the old world of Warhammer are agents and enforcers of the Sigmarite Church. They are obviously based on the old stereotypes of medieval witch hunting in the real world. You know, self-righteous and overzealous religious fanatics who go about the land and see witches under every rock and behind every tree. Of course, in Warhammer, evil witches do exist, and they can do a lot of damage using their chaos magic, or other kinds of magic really. The story in this trilogy is, however, about a rather competent and reasonable witch hunter named Matthias Thulmann. And throughout the narrative, we will see this guy basically follow an old nemesis from his past, akin to a Sherlock Holmes-ian figure following his version of Moriarty. In fact, the comparisons to Sherlock Holmes here are quite abundant, as we more or less follow an, investigator doing investigating. There's a lot of mysteries that get unraveled and conspiracies afoot which Thulmann gets to shine a light on. And right off the bat, we actually have one of the first quirks of this series, which is its naming. The first book is titled Witch Hunter, the second is Witch Finder, and the third is Witch Killer. Which does make you scratch your head a little bit because usually you got to find a witch before you hunt it and kill it. This issue is even further enhanced by the fact that the trilogy as a whole is often called the Witch Hunter Trilogy, which is also the name of the first book. So that can make it a bit confusing for people who aren't familiar with this series, or Warhammer books in general, I guess. But that's neither here nor there, just a bit of trivia. We are here to talk about the story and the themes and the characters though. I am gonna issue a spoiler warning right now because I would like to take a slightly different approach to this series in this video. We are going to briefly cover the entire trilogy today, and not just the first volume. And in order to do that, while I'm not gonna be going into too much detail on the plot points and what happens to the characters, I will be referencing some of the plot elements, and not necessarily in a chronological order. So fair warning, there are gonna be some light spoilers ahead. Like we did with the other books, let's actually use the summary of the book cover for starters. To quote, "In the grim medieval old world, the dreaded witch hunters are feared above all others. These tyrannical individuals are tasked with hunting out evil through the towns and villages, using whatever means they find necessary in order to destroy those foolish enough to work with the dark powers. Counted among the most zealous of the witch hunters is Matthias Thulmann, whose ruthless and legendary exploits are recounted to terrify the citizens of the Empire. CL Werner tells the action-packed tale of Matthias Thulmann as he strives to free the Empire from evil and corruption. A bit pompous, this description, as it doesn't actually reflect what the story and the character are really about, ironically. Anyway, moving on. Fun fact, this was actually from the cover of the whole omnibus, which was released in 2008, I believe. So, at least for me, this trilogy is another one of those series that feels newer than it actually is. And unlike the Sigmar trilogy, this one is even older. With Witch Hunter being published all the way back in 2004, and the other two books in 2005 and 2006 respectively. So they are more than 2 decades old at this point. Just to keep you informed, if nothing else. They are written by CL Werner, another veteran author who's written a ton of Warhammer stuff, both in fantasy and 40k. Maybe most noteworthy as far as fantasy is concerned, the very enjoyable and a lot funnier than this, Thanquol and Bone Ripper trilogy, and the equally enjoyable Brunner the Bounty Hunter, which I really wish he would have continued more than he wrote at the time. But he's written a lot more than those two. Anyway, back to Witch Hunter. This is a series that, I think, had at least a couple of major goals in mind when it started, or before it started rather. If not for the whole trilogy, then at least for the first volume. The first of these goals was to show an actually competent witch hunter in the form of Matthias Thulmann. Now, like I said earlier, we are all probably familiar with the old concepts of witch hunters from medieval times. Basically, a terrifying figure of authority that can randomly come into your village or town and start pointing fingers towards people or practices that are seen as suspicious. And one thing that these types of characters have in common is the fact that they are overzealous and very unreasonable. They always claim the higher moral ground and have an uncanny ability to turn people against each other. And let's face it, it's probably not very difficult to do that in the villages of the Empire, where most people aren't exactly scholars. So, to turn the tables on this stereotype, Thulmann is actually a guy who cares about doing his job properly, and not just fulfill his quota of burn heretics and moving on. He uses his brain and his wits to uncover the actually guilty party. Most of the time anyway. Which is a lot more than you can say about some of his co-workers in the Sigmarite Church. And that's another theme that is featured heavily in the books. Namely, the friction between individual witch hunters and their fellow Templars of Sigmar. As well as friction between Thulmann and his bosses. Not all witch hunters are the same at the end of the day, and the contrast between differing methods of uncovering heretics is both shown and discussed in these stories. Earlier I said that there's 2 main goals that the author had in mind, at least in my opinion. And the second one is, I think, wanting to write a Sherlock Holmes-esque mystery, but, you know, in the universe of Warhammer. And despite the fact that this universe is chock full of fantasy races and creatures and monsters, this type of story actually fits very well. I think it works because the mystery and the investigation elements are ramped up, while the over-the-topness of usual Warhammer stories is toned down. Thulmann is definitely not a guy who kills 500 Chaos Warriors in one bullet. This story, at the end of the day, I think does feel a bit more grounded, and by this story I do mean Witch Hunter, the first book. In this book, the protagonist is sent to a relatively remote rural region called Klausberg, ruled by a noble family called the Klausners. It is here that a number of peasants and livestock and that kind of stuff had been killed in rather gruesome fashion, and Thulmann is sent to find out what's actually going on. Is it a monster? Are there heretics about? Is there a deeper cause for concern? It's also worth mentioning, I think, that this noble family in Klausberg is friends with the Emperor. Or at least, you know, in the uncle's, father's, sister's, boyfriend, cousin kind of thing. But there are some points where Thulmann is politically pressed to solve the case. And all this investigation and unraveling of mysteries and murders is the bulk of the book, fortunately. In, like I said, the Sherlock Holmes-esque fashion. Because Thulmann doesn't just go to the village and starts burning people left and right. There's actual investigation. There's peasant murders, and there's a secret ritual linked to a murder, and then there's more murders, and more secrets, and more monsters that appear, and the noble family may or may not be involved, and all that sort of stuff. In fact, the atmosphere of this story is very similar to The Hound of the Baskervilles, for those who know it. Except that, the monsters are real. But I'm not gonna spill it beyond that. Or, if any of you are familiar with it, the story is about the Beast of Gévaudan. In case you don't know, that's actually a real-life kind of story. In France, back in the 1760s, there was some kind of monster that killed a lot of livestock and people in the Gévaudan region. Actually, more than 100 people, supposedly. But nobody knew what it was, until a hunter apparently killed it. Some said it was some kind of hybrid or an overgrown wolf or a lion. If any of you watched the 2001 movie Brotherhood of the Wolf, a French movie actually, the atmosphere in this book is quite similar to that. Eventually, it does turn out that a noble family and their ancestors were indeed related to the story, but it wasn't just them. And of course, there's a bigger evil in play, or multiple evils even. But I said I won't spoil everything, so I won't. Small segue here, even if you don't read the other two books, Witch Hunter, this book, is definitely one that I'd recommend. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention one of the other main characters of this trilogy, which does bring a bit more humor, gruffness, and mercenary spirit to the story. This is a guy called Streng. Streng is the torturer slash sidekick slash almost friend to Thulmann, who is a competent fighter in his own right and a specialist. Of course, with Thulmann being basically a member of the church, Streng is one of those characters that embodies traits that Matthias doesn't have. He's rude, he goes drinking and whoring whenever he can, and never misses a chance to display a selfish mercenary spirit. But he is also quite loyal to Thulmann and does bring a bit of humor to some rather dark moments. He's also a really good torturer, which is why Thulmann basically employs him to follow him around. There are other characters as well, an independent, strong noblewoman who helps in the investigations and action in the second and third books. There's also a Knight of Moor, who's basically a giant dude in black armor who does the work of a dozen warriors by himself. The plot does thicken, no pun intended, beyond the first volume of the book, and Thulmann eventually follows in the wake of a mad doctor/scientist type, with whom he has a score to settle. There's also Skaven involved, and necromancy, and a few other elements that wouldn't be out of place in a Gotrek and Felix saga. Although, like I said before, Thulmann is not a one-man army like Gotrek. There are still investigation aspects in the second and third books, namely Witchfinder and Witchkiller, but they are enhanced with a lot more action and conspiracy stuff. There's also multiple plot lines with the villain and a couple of other characters, which I don't think were absolutely necessary, because, first of all, the second and the third books are shorter than the first one. And the first one isn't that long to begin with. Actually, that one too is a bit shorter than your average Gotrek and Felix book, if we can use that as a metric. Secondly, I think the shortness of the latter books does a bit of a disservice to the series, which at the core was meant, at least in my opinion, to be kind of a battle of wits, even with supernatural elements between Thulmann and his Moriarty-esque nemesis. But there's a lot more explosive action and a bit less investigation and mystery as the rest of the story unfolds, which definitely didn't bode well because the story isn't entirely finished, but more on that in a few moments. Another major theme of the series, in my opinion, is the darkness of the human soul, if you'll allow me to be a bit more poetic. Coming around to witch hunters overall, There's always that aspect of accusing an innocent person, and maybe even killing them, and then having to live with it. While this is not a huge focus in the overall narrative, Thulmann does have a few regrets of his past, let's call them. And he does have to live with doing something like that. And like any complex character, he does struggle with it, especially since he did it himself at least once. He also struggles with the injustices done by other witch hunters who don't investigate in a reasonable and competent fashion half the time. He also regrets events that he might have participated in, but where he couldn't actually do anything, because, he was of a lower rank, or he didn't have enough influence and whatnot. I also have a feeling that, given how short the second and third books are, the series was either meant to be 2 longer books, or maybe 4 or more books. I'm saying that because, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the series doesn't really end entirely conclusively. Some of the plot threads are resolved, so there is some sense of finality, but it's like 60 or 70% finality, if you know what I mean. At least one more book could have been written with the plot threads that were left dangling here. Unfortunately, that never happened, because the third book was published in 2006, and there has been nothing since. Now, there isn't exactly a cliffhanger per se, so if you're worried about not reading it because of that, you don't have to be. It could have ended better, sure, but there is at least some finality. Maybe CL Werner didn't want to continue the story, or maybe Black Library kept him busy writing with other stuff. I guess we'll never know. So, maybe the most relevant question you would have after all this is the Witch Hunter trilogy worth reading? The answer is, at least in my opinion, yes. Because it does have a lot of the hallmarks of a typical Warhammer story, if that's what you're into, like, monsters and fighting and GrimDark elements and conspiracies. But like I said earlier, it's also a bit more realistic in the narrative, at least in the first volume. If nothing else, I would heartily recommend you check out Witch Hunter, because it is by far the best part of the trilogy. And if you enjoyed that, you can read the rest and treat all of it like just one big story. The second and third volumes do flow immediately into one another, for what it's worth. And like our duo of characters leaves Klausberg at the end of the first volume, and in the second book they arrive at their next destination like a couple of days later. Definitely worth mentioning as well, and I should have done this earlier, are the 3 prequel short stories for the trilogy, namely A Choice of Hatreds, Meatwagon, and Witchwork. All these stories are actually very good and more or less self-contained. So while you don't absolutely have to read them before the first volume, I do recommend reading them at some point. Meatwagon is actually kind of a From Dusk Till Dawn type of story, with Thulmann, Strang, and a bunch of others having to hole up in an abandoned temple against a horde of ghouls. Witchwork does see Matthias Thulmann investigate an actual evil witch, and that story does lead directly into the book Witch Hunter. Anyway, as usual, I do hope you folks enjoyed this retrospective or review or discussion about Witch Hunter, and do subscribe if you'd like to see more. Join me on Patreon for narrations and Rumble for lore videos. I do welcome any of your thoughts on this trilogy. Do let me know if you read it. What are your thoughts on it? Is it among your favorite Warhammer books? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let's get some engagement going. Until next time, thanks a lot for watching or listening, and Sigmar's blessings be upon you.